The find method is similar to the findByOne we've just covered in a sense that it also takes an object as its first and only argument, where we can specify the query and sort properties in order to apply data filtering and sorting respectively. The main difference is of course in the amount of model instances that this method can return. It can virtually return as many as needed. So if we were to perform the same exact query here with the find method instead of the findOne, we would get two results. Moving on, one other thing that the findOne doesn't support and the find method does is pagination, more specifically cursor pagination. If you're not familiar how the cursor pagination works, do check it out. There is a lot of material on the topic already out there. But in a nutshell, every time we retrieve a set of records from a database, we also receive a cursor, which is basically a piece of info that tells us where in the list of all records in the database we're currently located, and which records we need to fetch as part of the next sequence of data, or in other words, as part of the next page. Once we fetch the next page, we get a new cursor. That again tells us from where to start in order to get the data that belongs to the next page, and so on. Once we reach the end of the list, we simply don't receive a new cursor, and that's it. That's why the object that's returned from the find method call is not just a plain array, but actually an instance of the internal collection class, which contains the getMeta method that can provide us with all of the necessary pagination information. Let's try to call it and see what we'll get. As we can see, we have the cursors for the next and previous pages here, the hasPreviousPage and hasNextPage flags, and finally the total count that shows us the total number of records that the provided query covered. By default, it is not calculated, but if we wanted to get it, we can just set the total count property to true here. And now we can see that instead of null, number 2 was returned. The next and previous cursors are null simply because there are only 2 records in our database, and the initial list of records contains all of the records. But for demonstration purposes, if we'd instruct the database driver to limit the amount of returned records to 1 like so, we'd see that first, as expected, a single book model instance would be returned from the find method call, and also that we'd get the cursor which we can use to show the next sequence or page of records. So let's make another query with the same arguments, but let's also provide the cursor so we can access the next page. We can do that using the after property like so. And this pretty much covers the fundamentals of the find method. But do note one thing, in the examples in this and the previous video, where we covered the findOne method, we are performing very simple queries in terms of data filtering. So it's probably useful to see how we can write more complex queries. We will cover this in the next video, where we'll also touch upon the Commodo library's idea on how a storage driver should work and what should we expect of them when it comes to supporting database-specific querying capabilities. For now, let's end this video with the last method that the withStorageHigherOrder function provides for us, and that is the count method. As the name itself suggests, the method enables us to get the total number of records that exist in the database. So doing a simple count call on the book model like this would return 2, because that's the number of books we currently have stored. And as with the findOne and find methods, we can also utilize the query property as part of the first argument to specify what records we want to cover when the count is performed. So by setting this object to the query property, we are instructing the count method to count all books that have its title set to first book. And of course, if we take a look at the console, we can see that the count result is now 1. You can use this method, for example, when showing the number of records in tables, or to maybe check if there are existing records already in the database. But also note that when doing regular finds using the find method, the total count can be already included in the received meta object by setting the already seen total count flag to true. Alright, finally to sum up, in these 2 videos we've covered 4 main methods that we can use to query the database: the findById, findOne, find, and count. While the first 2 methods are used to get a single entry from the database, the find method enables us to virtually fetch any amount of data and paginate it using the explained cursor pagination approach. And if we just wanted to know how many entries are there in the database, we can use the provided count method. To conclude, in the following video, we'll try to explain the Commodo library's idea on how the storage drivers should work in general and what we should expect of them when it comes to executing more complex queries and how we should use the database-specific mechanisms and utilities.